as we speak, it is turning into World War III. The NATO countries, which is really to say the U.S., have backed the Russians into a corner, and the Russians are going to have to react by building up armies, which they're doing with the draft. It's provocative. It becomes a tit for tat thing. The Russians, or next will be the Chinese, say, these armies are being built up. We ought to counter move and build our army up. And then there's a counter move. So it's quite dangerous.
The 2020s may be the decade that we see a major financial collapse, system breakdown, or even the start of a greater depression, says our next guest, Doug Casey. He is the founder of Casey Research, the author of the Crisis Investing newsletter, and the author of several best-selling books, including Crisis Investing in the 80s and Crisis Investing for the rest of the 90s. Welcome back to the show, Doug. Always good to see you.
Thanks, David. It's nice to be here, although you're in Vancouver, I'm in Buenos Aires.
Yes, different time zones, very different places, very different jurisdictions, social structures, and political structures. I was reading that in Argentina, the inflation rate has just gone down to zero, but we can talk about that in just a bit. I'd like to get your bigger picture outlook first. You have talked about how this decade has the potential to become very unpleasant, I think were your words in a post. Let's talk about what's going on right now. There are currently about 56 conflicts globally happening, according to the Institute for Economics and Peace. This is more than at any time since World War II. I wonder why there are so many skirmishes, wars, and global conflicts happening right now, more than any other time in the last 70 years.
Rudolf Steiner said over 100 years ago, war is the health of the state. And for the last 100 years, roughly, the state itself has been all over the world. All governments have been growing like cancers. Typically, 100 years ago, before World War I, I should say, governments took 5, maximum 10% of the GDP to sustain themselves. Now we're talking about 40, 50%, 60% in some cases. So I put that at the root of the problem. But that's theoretical and economic. Looking at these various wars, what's the big one? Well, it's the Ukraine, the dust-up between the Ukraine and Russia. It's insane. This is really nothing but a border war between two countries. And people forget that the word Ukraine means borderland. Peoples and armies have been flowing across that area for 1,000 years. In fact, you might recall when, I don't know how much time we ought to talk about just that, because there are 50 of these things, as you pointed out, going on around the world. So how much detail should we spend on any of them? But the biggest and the most dangerous one certainly is the thing in the Ukraine. It has the prospect of turning into World War III. In fact, as we speak, it is turning into World War III. The NATO countries, which is really to say the U.S., have backed the Russians into a corner, and the Russians are going to have to react. Now, how they react, I don't know. That's unpredictable. But the only thing we have going in our favor to save us from being turned into cinders is the fact that Putin is very well educated, very historically knowledgeable, very centered, thoughtful, and prudent, certainly by comparison with any of the other world leaders he's confronting. And I know it's very dangerous for me to say something like this. I'd be called a Putin apologist, but I'm just picking the best of a bad bunch, actually, when I say that.
Before we continue with the interview, let me tell you about how your privacy is being breached. Do you know how much of your personal information is on the internet? Data brokers collect and sell your personal data, exposing you to risks like identity theft and harassment. but there is a solution. Today's sponsor, Delete Me, is a service that removes your personal information from hundreds of data broker websites. Using Delete Me is quite simple. Just submit your personal information for removal, and their privacy experts will handle the rest. In 7 days, you'll receive a privacy report showing where your data was found and removed. Delete Me continuously monitors and removes your information all year long. Get 20% off of all U.S. consumer plans with Delete Me by going to joindeleteme.com/DavidLin and using the promo code DavidLin at checkout. You can also scan the QR code on the screen here directly from your phone. Join the thousands who trust Delete Me to keep their data private. Get Delete Me today and start taking control of your online privacy. Well, how is Russia being backed into a corner, you said, by the U.S.? How's that happening?
Well, you may recall that a long time ago, when the Soviet Union fell apart, and it was a long time ago now, it was 1991, the Russians were promised that NATO would not expand beyond its current limits way back then. And of course, since then, it's acquired every country in between the old borders of NATO and Russia itself, including Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Romania, all of them. So that was a breaking of the word. In fact, NATO should have been abolished when the Warsaw Pact was abolished. NATO was formed in order to defend the West against the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the Warsaw Pact with it, but it wasn't abolished. It's turned into what they call a self-licking ice cream cone since then, where its purpose is not what it was supposed to be, but its purpose is to maintain and increase itself. So, but now with the accession of the Ukraine, the Russians are especially concerned about that because the Ukraine has a 2,000-kilometer border with Russia. And the West has been very, very aggressive. So this whole thing with the Ukraine actually directly started in 2014 with the Maidan Revolution. There was I think his name was Yanukovych, but he was friendly to the interests of Russia. He was overthrown by a coup in the Ukraine and replaced with West-leaning people that wanted to get the Ukraine into NATO and perhaps the European Union and so forth. What people have forgotten about that is that when that happened in 2014, the Donbas provinces broke off. They seceded from the Ukraine. Why? Because they're populated almost entirely by Russians, Russian-speaking people. And Kiev, at that point, mounted a war against those provinces in which about 20,000 people killed. And we don't hear about this stuff in the West so much. In any event, Putin said that's got to end. And that's what his military adventure into the Ukraine was all about. I don't approve of that. I don't approve of one country invading another country, but he was trying to solve a problem. Not in the optimal way, obviously. But since then, this thing has degenerated. And now Biden and the U.S. don't even talk to the Russians. And when you're talking about something that could put us into World War III, it's actually quite idiotic not to even sit down at a table and discuss the problem.
Regardless of what Putin claims his initial objectives were, like you pointed out, the war has escalated now, civilians being killed in Ukraine. How can this war end, Doug? What is the solution to peace?
Well, if I was a Martian looking at this, the history of the Ukraine and what's going on, I would say that the Russians, in their demands or requirements are actually on the right side of the issue. We've got two things going on. Well, three things, actually more, but let me take three. Number one, the West promised that NATO would not come up against the border with Russia, which is very provocative, very dangerous. That should be held. Actually, NATO should be disbanded and abolished at this point. The Crimea, which has been Russian in population and politically, it's been Russian since the time of Catherine the Great. We're talking 200 years. Should become part of Russia. Crimea was only given to the Ukraine by Khrushchev for domestic purposes, internal politics. So the Crimea and Sebastopol, the largest Russian fleet base, that should be acknowledged as being Russian. And the last thing is those Donbas provinces, which are Russian, should be acknowledged as Russian, and the war should end. And who knows what the way this has turned out, but chances are excellent that as in a negotiation, the Russians would withdraw from all areas, except for the Donbass and Crimea, and that's how you end the war.
The counter argument is that if we give Putin those territories, he's just going to ask for more, if not outright invade other parts of Ukraine or Eastern Europe.
I know that's the argument, but to me, it doesn't make any sense. Look, Russia is the largest country in the world already. It covers 11 time zones. The last thing it needs is more territory. And it certainly doesn't need territory with people that don't want to be part of Russia. Russia's not in a position to roll over Europe. It would serve no useful purpose, economically, politically, or any other way. So this is a straw man. It makes no sense at all.
Part of the reason for that is that there is NATO. If we're arguing for a disbandment of NATO, wouldn't that make it more likely for Russia to invade, the northern part of Europe, Lithuania, which is on the border, the Baltic states, which are NATO members, right?
Yeah, well, people have got to realize that we don't live in ancient times anymore when there was actually an advantage to be had in invading a country. You got to steal the gold, the cattle, the artwork, and enslave the population. And it worked out. War could be a profitable activity. But in today's high-tech world, those things aren't really values anymore. And it's especially dangerous with the kind of weapons that we have today. I'm not just talking about nuclear weapons, which can clearly destroy the world. I'm talking about cyber weapons, which could destroy the world just in a different way from nuclear weapons, biological weapons that certainly get the job done. So it's much riskier now than it was then, and there's nothing to be gained. Why would the Russians want to invade Europe and take on a massive guerrilla war for themselves? And most of the wealth in the world is technologically oriented, easily transferred, can't be effectively stolen by armed force as in the old days. So no, that's not going to happen. And if you look at Putin, we're talking about a totally different kind of character than with past. They compare him to Hitler. They love to compare him to Hitler. It's a ridiculous comparison. No comparison at all.
What is your view on conscription in the draft? It seems to be trending. I want to use that word amongst some politicians. Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of the UK, has announced that a future Conservative government would bring back mandatory national service if they win in July. Here in the U.S., the House of Representatives recently passed a measure on Friday which would automatically register men aged 18 to 26 for selective service. They're not forcing the draft. It's just suppose this were to pass, it would make registration automatic. Yes, France, Emmanuel Macron promised to bring back national service to France as well. There seems to be this trend amongst NATO nations. Why is this happening? What's your view on conscription in the draft?
Makes me think of that rock song from the 60s, Induction, Destruction, Who Wants to Die? The draft is involuntary servitude. It's actually taking free citizens and, in effect, putting them in jail for X number of years. In fact, in some ways, induction in the draft is worse than going to jail because the chances of your actually being killed or having to kill somebody else are much greater than going to jail. So the draft itself is immoral. And I would point out that any country that needs to force people to, any government or country that needs people to force people to fight for it, probably isn't worth fighting for. If a country is in danger, historically, if people love their country, they will join up to fight a foreign enemy who's invading. So this is all warmongering. It's all the building of the state. It's horrible. I totally disapprove of it as being anti-freedom. And by building up armies, which they're doing with the draft, it's provocative. It becomes a tit for tat thing. The Russians, or next will be the Chinese, say, these armies are being built up. We ought to counter move and build our army up. And then there's a counter move. So it's quite dangerous.
Well, who are they preparing to fight, Doug? I know that's a very open-ended, broad question. I know there's a war going on in Russia, but they're not actively involved in directly fighting Russia. This isn't the Vietnam War where there are troops in the jungle, right? Who's the enemy?
Well, I don't think the Russians are our enemy. You may recall that Putin asked to join NATO. He asked to join the economic union in the past. He's always made friendly overtures. And I'd point out that Russia today has no resemblance to the Soviet Union, which is dead and gone. Russia has a national income tax of, I think they just raised it because of the war, but it's still only 13%. So if you start a business in Russia, which you certainly can, your taxes are lower in Russia than they are in Western Union, for that matter. Friends of mine have visited Russia recently, and they find it calm, peaceful, clean. It should not be perceived as an enemy. And the country and its leader are being demonized pointlessly at this point.
Yes, you're right. At one point, Russian-U.S. relations were much better. In fact, you were talking about the early 2000s when Putin talked about joining NATO, possibly. Russia aided the U.S. post 9/11. Why have Russian and U.S. relations deteriorated in the past 20 years? And in fact, just recently, Russia calls the U.S. an enemy state for the first time. Those are their words since the Cold War, calling the U.S. an enemy state. So it's not just the U.S. thinking the Russians are an enemy. The Russian state has now declared the U.S. an enemy. How has this happened?
Well, that is a recent phenomenon. The Russians did not used to think of the U.S. In those terms. And I can see why they do, because the U.S. has, nobody knows the number. Maybe the U.S. government doesn't even know the number, but it's said that there are something like 800 U.S. bases around the world. That's very provocative. The U.S. aircraft carrier battle groups sailing around the world, intimidating. the defense budget of the U.S. equals that of, they say, the next 8 or 10 countries combined. So, yeah, there's reason to be afraid of the U.S., especially since a group that are called the neocons have actually taken control of U.S. foreign policy. They're very aggressive, thinking that they can impose something that they call democracy on any and every country. It's like they're playing a game of Risk with other people's money and other people's lives. So I think the most dangerous country in the world today, by far, it's not China, it's not Russia, it's not Iran, it's not even North Korea, although that's a special case with an unbalanced, definitely unbalanced person running it. The most dangerous country in the world. And it's not the country, it's actually Washington, D.C., and the kind of people that live within it, who live in their own world, quite frankly. They just talk to each other. They all believe the same thing. They all say the same thing. They have the same interests. Washington, D.C. has become the new Mordor, if you would.
Do you think that the rise of more conflicts around the world, which we talked about at the beginning, is a result of the U.S. losing its role as a global hegemon? Historically, Doug, whenever there was one sole superpower in the world, there tended to be less or fewer conflicts. It's only when countries are vying for power that we get more outbreaks of conflicts. Is that what's going on?
Well, that is a theory that's been put forward. Uh, who is the historian that's put this forward? It's a question of an obviously failing power, seeing rising powers, thinking that it has to act and put down the rising powers before they get too strong and too out of control. And at this point, the U.S. is the failing power. That's what the $35 trillion of acknowledged debt is all about. And they can see that, for instance, with the coming election in November, it doesn't matter if Trump wins or Biden wins. And incidentally, I'll just parenthetically throw out, I'd say the chances of Biden actually running are slim and none, and Slim's out of town. But that's a whole different conversation. Uh, the U.S. is becoming quite unstable in a lot of ways. And a lot of these people think in terms of, well, war has always been good to the U.S. in the past. Maybe what we need to do is start a foreign war. Serves several purposes. It distracts the people within the United States, which it does. It unites them, which it does. And they think that this coming war, it seems, will be like the last war, where the U.S. will go from strong to stronger. I don't think so.
You don't think that the U.S. Well, why not? I mean, during the Cold War, there was always a fear that the Russians would overtake the U.S. Right? That didn't happen. It seems like that's playing out again now.
Well, the U.S. is not in the same position as it used to be in all kinds of ways.
Okay.
Look, war really doesn't do anybody any good. I mean, we can argue about that. War is good, bad, it's necessary, but I'd like to see an argument why this war, which is building, could possibly be good, and why it could be necessary. Have you heard any arguments that would indicate that it's either good or necessary?
I don't even know which war would really affect the people of America, Canada, where I live. I mean, it seems to me that there's these foreign wars that are being fought, and the economy domestically needs to react to this somehow, right? How do you think this will ultimately impact our standard of living? These rising conflicts, emergence of wars around the world.
I think it can only reduce the standard of living. That's all there is to it, because war creates nothing. It only destroys things. That's the bottom line. So
Okay.
I'm simply anti-war. That's all there is to it.
Well, let's talk about how you think the economy will evolve over the next decade. Irrespective of wars, hopefully they don't escalate beyond what we have currently today. Independent of that, how do you think the economies in the G7 nations or perhaps other nations around the world will change in the next decade or two?
Well, I want to point out that I'm a long-term optimist. In fact, I think the
Yes.
future is not only going to be better than you can imagine, better than you imagine, but better than you can imagine. And why is that? Uh, Track record of humanity starting 12,000 years ago after the end of the last ice age, it's been up, 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 but up, up, up on a hyperbolically accelerating curve, especially since the Industrial Revolution. And there's no reason why that should end at this point with the evolution of nanotechnology and artificial intelligence and robotics and uh, uh, biotech and many other things. So there's lots of cause for optimism from that point of view. And the second reason is that the average person is wired in a way like a squirrel, where we genetically feel we have to produce more than we consume and save the difference. Well, so you can last through the winter. So there's plenty of reason to be super optimistic about the future, and I am, okay? So why am I pessimistic about the next 10 years at least? Well, the specter of war at this point is building up, and the destruction from this coming war, nuclear, biological, cybernetic, is potentially much greater than World War II could be. And it could stop those two mainsprings that I mentioned that are keeping mankind moving forward. But one thing that people don't adequately consider is the amount of debt in the world. Uh, People look on debt as just something that's out there. It'll be handled. It'll be paid off. But what are we talking about with debt? Uh, Most of the debt in the world, all of the government debt, quite frankly, which is most of the debt, is consumption debt. Uh, and when you have consumption debt, it means that it's not there to produce new things, build new factories or whatever. It can be paid off one of two ways, either by mortgaging your future or by taking the savings of others in the past and dissipating it. So debt in itself uh, is not a good thing, especially not government debt, which is always consumption debt as opposed to production debt. So that's a very big thing. The amount of regulation in the world, which is stopping producers from producing and distorting the way the market works, that's a major thing. Uh, Inflation of the currency. I mentioned that one of the two things that make me optimistic about the future is that the average guy sets aside things, produces more than he consumes, and saves. But what does he save in? He saves in the local currency. But if the local currency is destroyed, his savings are destroyed. And I think inflation is going to get completely out of control because modern monetary theory has been accepted. And what that means is that the government really can create all the money it wants and blow it into society. And they think if inflation gets too bad, well, we'll just tax some of it out from places that we want to tax it out of. And don't forget, the US now is running $2 trillion of annual deficits. And the central bank, the Fed, is buying it all and printing money, in effect, in order to do so. So that's a very brief. You asked a big question, David, and I'm
Mhm.
sorry to go on, but that's kind
No,
of a
please.
general précis of why I'm not optimistic about the next 10 years at least.
Yeah, let's break it down. Debt. Let's talk about debt first. You brought up debt several times. This is a comment from BlackRock CEO Larry Fink. He said,
But if I could convey one more important message today, it would be the countries that need growth most right now are not just emerging economies. Great economic powers, including the G7, are in fact on the list and need growth going forward. All of us are staring down a growth dilemma. Whether we solve it or not, it's a significant economic fork in the road for our countries. Today, the G7 average debt to GDP is 129%. No matter how much we tax, how much we cut or reduce that debt, it will not be enough. The only way we can achieve this future of growth is by truly growing out of it. But just growth is becoming more important because we need to be focusing on our fiscal health. It is also becoming much more difficult to achieve. Within 25 years, most of the G7 countries will be on demographic downslope. Working age population will decline. The ceiling on growth will get lower and lower. This is why building new infrastructure is critical, especially through public-private partnerships. Infrastructure investments is a counterforce to the high-debt, low-growth economies.
I would like you to comment or respond to that. Why is building new infrastructure the solution to, I guess, our debt crisis?
Well, I don't think it is. So he acknowledges the fact that debt is a problem. And at some point, the people that owe the debt may not be able to pay it. That's going to have negative consequences. But how is building new infrastructure going to solve the debt problem? This is very unclear why he jumped to that conclusion. And what really disturbs me about what he just said is that this can be done, should be done with a public-private partnership. Well, that's an insane statement. Public-private partnerships are things that shouldn't even exist. I'm not going off on a tangent here, but I've got to mention this. The U.S., in fact, most of the world, have fascist economic systems. People say, what are you talking about? Fascism? Fascism has nothing to do with jackboots and big flags and this type of thing. It's an economic system. The word fascism was coined by Benito Mussolini. And what it means is it's a partnership between the corporations and the state. And of course, fascism as a system treats people in corporations, big corporations, like Larry Fink, very well. But I think it's a bad thing.
Okay, how is that different from a communist system where the corporation is owned by the state? Isn't that a form of partnership as well? And they're conflicting ideologies, are they not? Fascism and communism?
No, communism is where the state actually owns everything. Everything is owned by the state.
Okay.
Period. Socialism is economically defined as a system where the means of production are owned by the state, but private goods like houses, cars, your clothes are owned by you as an individual. That's a socialist system. A fascist system is where both the means of production and private goods are owned individually. General Motors and the rest of this, they're all owned by the shareholders. But they're controlled and regulated and taxed and monitored by the state. That's what fascism is. That's what Mussolini defined it as.
Walk us through what's wrong with that. Why can't we have government regulation of large corporations? Or why shouldn't we have?
Well, what does the government bring to the party? It produces nothing. It's a dead hand on society. It's not necessary. And in principle, the problem with the government is that it's pure coercion. As Mao Tse-tung said, certainly one of the world's leading experts on government, is the power of government comes out of the barrel of a gun. And if you believe in a society based on cooperation as opposed to coercion. You want to limit institutionalized coercion. And that's what the state is. It's not we, the people. It's the people in the government controlling the rest of us. So I'm against.
Yes.
I'm against any government involvement in the economy at all. Forget about a public-private partnership.
Let me just present to you a statistic now. I'm not advocating for communism or socialism or a command economy. I'm just pointing out something that has happened in China, which, as you know, is, I guess, by strict definition, a command economy, although that's debatable nowadays. It's been reported by several journals, including The Economist, that the country has now become a scientific superpower, surpassing the U.S. in the number of scientific publications in high-impact scientific journals annually. More citations, more papers published, more patents being introduced on a regular annual basis than the U.S. now. This, no doubt, is the result of the ingenuity of Chinese scientists, but one could argue the command structure of the economy. Could you respond to that?
I don't think it's because of the command structure of the economy.
Okay.
It's because when Deng Xiaoping, in about 1980, he said, what was his famous phrase?
We have to catch up to the West. Why are you referring to that?
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't matter whether we have a black cat or a white cat, as long as it catches mice, and to be wealthy is to be rich is to be wonderful, whatever the phrase was he used. It was well stated. I'm not stating it the way he did.
Yeah.
The reason for progress in the Chinese economy is that it was tremendously freed up and has been freed up until quite recently. So it's not that the state was controlling things. Wherever the state sticks its finger, it creates distortions and misallocations of capital, corruption, wastage. The reason China has done as well as it has, and what has happened since Deng freed it up over the last 40 years, is actually, well, it's one of the biggest things in world history, quite frankly. China went from being a completely backward police state with poor, ignorant peasants to one of the fastest growing and most prosperous in world history, quite frankly. But it's not because of the prudent guidance of the Chinese Communist Party. That's just a scam for the people that are members of the party. It's because China was largely really freed up. It was one of the best places in the world to be an entrepreneur, to be a producer over the last 40 years. That's changing now because Xi seems to have a different philosophy, and he's the new helmsman that is steering the ship. I think Xi is steering the ship onto the rocks. But the progress of China is not because the government was guiding it. It's because the government wasn't, by and large, guiding it over the last 40 years.
So given these trends in the world and economies, both domestically and abroad, let's talk about investment implications and I guess where you would park your capital if you were a long-term investor. Now, in the 1970s, you'd identified a good opportunity in gold. You had speculated that following of Nixon taking the dollar off the gold standard, that gold would rise in value. It was undervalued at the time due to government suppression. Are there any such assets today that you think are grossly undervalued and would change given a change in government policy?
Well, I'm always looking for them. And of course, everything becomes obvious in retrospect. But is there anything right now that's as much of a one-way street as gold was back in the early 70s? Well, to start with, let me say that I view gold as not anymore as a speculative medium. I view it as a savings medium. It's not an investment. An investment is an allocation of capital to produce new capital. And owning gold doesn't do that. That's why Warren Buffett says that it's like a pet rock. It doesn't produce anything. Well, a $100 bill doesn't produce anything either. So is there any gold lookalike now? I continue to use gold as a savings vehicle. It's treated me very well. Something that I was buying for $35 is now $2,300. So it's treated me very well over the years. But what is like gold back in 1971? If I was going to pick a commodity, I guess the commodity I would pick now would be uranium. I think it's going to be a one-way street. It's got to go a lot higher. Why? Because the world is going to go to nuclear power. Nuclear is the safest, the cheapest, and the cleanest form of mass power generation, vastly superior to so-called green power. And I know the things that I said about safest, cleanest, and cheapest. People are probably saying, what? How can that be? I've never heard that. That's crazy. And we can talk about that, but then this would be a show about uranium and nuclear power. And I don't know if you want to go that way, but I'll make that assertion and I can defend it anytime you'd like. Anyway, at this point, assuming that the world is going to go electric with EVs and with giant server farms that are needed for AI and other things, the only way that power can be generated is with nuclear, at least until fusion comes on board. And the money that's being spent for so-called green energy, which is to say photovoltaic and wind energy, is a huge misallocation. It's fine for certain applications in certain places. That's fine. But it's not meant for the mass powering of an industrial civilization. So the answer to the question is uranium, which you'll need for the nuclear power plants.
Are you making the assumption that the world is heading towards mass electrification? This is a separate question, but do you think that countries around the world will be successful, especially the West, in reaching their zero emissions targets for cars by 2035? I think in the U.S. it's zero emissions in total by 2050.
Well, I think that takes us to the subject of global warming, which I see as actually a ridiculous scam. The chances are actually.
How is that a scam? Yeah.
Well, because everybody said that we have to keep our carbon footprint low. We can't use oil and gas or coal because these things generate carbon dioxide. In fact, they're saying you can't even have herds of cows because the cows emit carbon dioxide and methane, and they're going to warm the world. This has gotten completely out of control. It's become a hysteria. And oddly enough, the same people that believe in reducing your carbon footprint don't seem to understand that the only effective way to do that and still have an industrial civilization is with nuclear power. So they're kind of self-contradictory that way. But then again, the people that believe these things are not science-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they say they believe in the science, whatever that is, but they don't understand that. Well, so where do we want to go on this? I'd say uranium is
right.
as close as we can come to gold in 1971. It's about, I don't know what it is today as we speak, $85. But the Chinese, the Japanese, and a lot of other rising powers are building lots of nuclear plants. It's going to take lots of uranium. It's going higher because from the time that you find a uranium deposit to putting it into production takes minimum 5, probably more like 10 years.
What I'm concerned about is what is going to happen to the cost of electricity if, let's say, the auto industry is to stick to the government's plan of zero emissions by 2035, which is just 10 years from now, Doug?
Historically, the cost of electricity has gone down, down, down over the years. Is that trend going to continue? Not with government policies the way they are. Quite frankly, look, the best way to reduce the cost of electricity is to generate lots more of it. And the best way to generate lots more of it is with nuclear power plants, and preferably not third generation nuclear power plants, the big multi-billion dollar things, but smaller nuclear power plants that are closer to the type of thing that nuclear submarines use. Small, efficient, extremely powerful. There are designs out there now that you build a nuclear power plant self-contained, don't even look at it for 10 years. So everybody could have their own nuclear power plant, or every reasonable sized city could have one. I think that's the way the future is going to go, but it's going to take a lot of uranium.
Well, we'll talk more in depth about uranium and nuclear power next time, Doug. I know you write about this in the Crisis Investing newsletter. Tell us about your work there. What else we can learn?
Well, what we do in that letter is look for high potential speculations. And people have a misapprehension about what a good speculation, or what a speculation is for that matter. It's different from an investment. An investment is where you, in effect, plant a seed of corn in order to grow an ear of corn. It's increasing capital. Speculation is a little bit different. In fact, if we lived in a free market society, which we don't actually, speculators would be unemployed. Why? Because speculators, an ideal speculation is one where you're taking advantage of a distortion in the market. And government is usually involved in creating these distortions. So there are, in the future, and there should be lots of speculations out there that you should be able to capitalize on. And what we look for in crisis investing is distortions in the market, where we can buy something cheap and sell it later when the psychology of the market changes, or when regulations change, or when technology changes. So that's what that letter is about. It's a particular approach to the market. Speculation can be a good thing. Now, it's not gambling. Gambling is very different. That's an even odds bet where the chances are random of winning or losing. That's very different from speculation. And too many people confuse the two of them, just like they confuse speculation with investing.
We appreciate your updates and your candor, Doug. It's always good to get your thoughts. We'll put the link to Crisis Investing down below, so make sure to follow Doug's work there. And I'll speak to you again next time, Doug. Thank you for coming on today.
It's a pleasure, David.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.